So this week we're reading about multiple species conservation planning and the MHPA and other habitat conservation plans in the San Diego area that attempted to balance development with habitat protection and biodiversity and its preservation over time. But I'm here today at San Bruno Mountain, which is the site of the United States and I think the world's first habitat conservation plan that was drawn up in 1983. So San Bruno Mountain behind me here rises about 1,300 feet up above the ocean and the Pacific here over Daly City, just south of San Francisco. You can see the fog bank coming in this very hazy and smoky day here just south of San Francisco. But San Bruno Mountain is kind of an ecological island that rises up at the northern end of the Santa Cruz Mountains. It's got over a dozen rare or endangered species that exist on it. It's got at least 4 butterflies that live almost no place on Earth but here. And it was the site for a series of environmental struggles from the 1960s, really all the way through the present. Most of it was privately owned, and so in the 1970s and 80s, local environmental activists attempted to stop development here on the mountain. A number of the endangered species, some of the butterflies, were listed under the Endangered Species Act, which was a piece of federal legislation passed in the early 1970s. And under the Endangered Species Act, any potential harm to the habitat of an endangered species could be blocked and held up in court every time there might be harm to that species. And so here on San Bruno Mountain, activists attempted to prevent development from taking place using the Endangered Species Act. A number of moderate environmental groups and political actors attempted to broker a compromise or find a middle ground between development and habitat preservation, endangered species protection. And they did so here at San Bruno Mountain through the crafting of what was called a habitat conservation plan. And so what took place here at San Bruno Mountain was a compromise that was worked out locally between local public authorities, between the private landowners that wished to develop housing, which is just up the slope from me here beyond these shipping containers, and also the federal government, the Fish and Wildlife Service, which had authority over endangered species. And so the compromise was that the land behind me on the top of the mountain and most of the mountain, 2,400 acres or so of the mountain, would be preserved and set aside as a habitat to be conserved, and no development would be allowed there. Habitat would be preserved there, which would allow for the rare species of plants and the butterflies to survive. Meanwhile, land over here where there was habitat for butterflies would be allowed to be developed. And so the Habitat Conservation Plan provided both preservation for the endangered species at a habitat level. In other words, to preserve sufficient amount of land in one place to preserve a whole habitat so that a species could survive there, while at the same time allowing adjacent land where there might be species, endangered species, to be developed and those endangered species to be destroyed. After the early 1980s, when this was framed here at San Bruno Mountain, other public officials across the West began to look to this strategy as a means to facilitate development in the context of the very diverse, rare habitats that exist, particularly in California, where just a few miles in distance could be entirely different ecosystems with entirely different plants and animals. The biodiversity of California really provided a great challenge to developers under the context of the Endangered Species Act. And so then, by the 1990s in San Diego, after the listing of the California gnatcatcher as an endangered species, the impetus grew among development interests to try to find a pathway that would allow them to develop their land while environmentalists could be satisfied and the Endangered Species Act could be satisfied by setting aside habitat in sufficient quantity that would allow those species to survive elsewhere. But here's the beginning of that process, and we'll talk about some of the implications of that the criticisms of the habitat conservation planning compromise. But nonetheless, here at San Bruno Mountain, this is the first place where one of those habitat conservation plans was established, and that, of course, was a habitat conservation plan that came out of the environmental movement of this area, the conservationist movement and the biodiversity movement that was strong in the San Francisco Bay Area. So, San Bruno Mountain, habitat conservation planning.